mic's Alrighty. So I'm going to begin today's talk by uh, talking about this notion, concentration in Buddhism. You probably have heard of it, right? It's typically the English translation for samadhi. There are many reasons that we could um, feel reserved about the um, term concentration. Number one, because it covers such a small and narrow aspect of what is actually samadhi. And then number two, the idea that samadhi is primarily about concentration, about narrowing your attention to a very small place, right? And then stabilizing it thereupon is, in my humble opinion, a fundamentally misleading idea. It doesn't really help, and it's primarily based on what is known as the commentarial tradition. In other words, using very influential texts like the Visuddhimagga, the path of purification, to interpret the early suttas. So, what exactly is samadhi in the early suttas? One way to understand it is that it's actually the process of diminishing and reducing craving. And then the direct result of that is you're made to feel at ease. You become non-distracted in the process. You're gladdened. You feel confident about the spiritual journey. Your whole person is rendered easeful and fulfilled as a result of actively cultivating dispassion or letting go. Okay, so that's primarily what samadhi is about. But nowadays, when people think about samadhi, number one, they think about, oh, it's really an exercise in concentration. And so, for example, if you focus really hard, right, on the use of a mantra, if you focus really hard on um, chanting a Buddha's name, if you stare at a mental picture that you conjure up in a process of visualization, right? If you stare at your nose tip or your navel, or some random body part for the purpose of stabilizing or locking down your attention. Uh, that's the sort of things that people associate with the practice of samadhi. And another thing about samadhi is that nowadays people uh, think of it as a state of shamatha, a state of stillness, a state of calm, right? Which is partially correct, but it is not exclusively about calm. It is not exclusively about stillness. It's also about vipassana, right? It's about insight. It's about investigation. It's about observation. And so in the early suttas, samadhi, without exception, is insight and calm conjoined together. So in your journey of developing samadhi, yes, you may, at some stage, give particular focus to one or the other, to calm or insight, right? But it doesn't mean that, in the mature state of samadhi, somehow insight is lacking or that it is devoid of, the uh, ability to carry out investigation and so forth. So you might ask, if we were to understand samadhi as primarily involving a reduction in craving, okay, how does that work exactly? Well, number one, the idea samadhi and the idea jhanas in the early suttas, they are described as having the potential to take a practitioner all the way to supramundane attainments. It is a self-sufficient practice. So it is not the case that, after you attain jhana, after you attain samadhi, you need to come out from it and then to carry out vipassana, carry out insight practice separately in order to attain supramundane attainments, right? In the early suttas, this is made very clear. The jhana itself, right, samadhi itself is self-sufficient. And the reason for it is, once again, because it is primarily about a reduction in craving. Now, we have to first understand how, in the Buddhist understanding of human psychology, craving equals stress, craving equals suffering. Okay, so it's not really even about how craving will eventually lead you to suffering. It's not even that. But it's that as you are experiencing craving right here and now, you are experiencing suffering. You are experiencing stress, right? And of course, there's going to be added stress, added suffering as a consequence of your giving rise to craving right now. So there's future suffering that comes from craving, but then there's also concurrent stress, suffering that comes alongside, right, simultaneous to craving. So craving is not, your generic greed. It's not just about, oh, you're greedy for money, you're greedy for fame, that sort of thing. Craving is a palpable writhing of the mind, if you will. So if you think of your mind as a bundle of mental muscles, right, craving is very specifically about the way you contort those muscles in a certain way. And so a skilled meditator is able to discern craving as it happens, the way the mind pushes really hard, like against some phenomena, not wanting them, the way the mind welcomes certain phenomena, right? The way the mind looks forward to certain phenomena, the way the mind exerts control, right? Or asserts itself to be someone, something, right? In the process of self-identification, in the selfing process. All of these are instances of craving, and all of these involve you're using the mind's muscles in a certain way. It's analogous to, say, you're frowning. Okay. So when you are frowning, what are you doing? You are exerting yourself. You're using the muscles in a certain way. And frowning itself is what? Is stressful. Okay. It requires energy on your part. It requires your straining yourself in a certain way. And just like frowning, because, um, we're really talking about the use of muscles of a very small area. And so the stress associated oftentimes elude your attention. And in the same way, too, um, we're so used to being completely hijacked by craving, delighting in craving, right? Focusing on its delight, focusing on the passion, focusing on the excitement, and so forth, that we hardly ever notice the way we're straining ourselves internally. Now, as you learn to discern craving and as you learn to pacify it, to reduce it, to diminish it, right? As you work towards a goal of completely eradicating craving from the mind stream, you would already be experiencing some measure of peace, some measure of relief. So you don't have to wait until craving is completely eradicated. Right? So in the same way, right now, as you try to relax a bit, the way you put together your body, so to speak, okay, the way you put together this posture, the way the nervous system is working, if you relax that a bit, if you pacify your person, so to speak, you will be experiencing some measure of relief. In the same way, too, craving is a load, craving is a burden that the mind habitually carries. And so if you can actively, consistently, for some extended period, be in the practice of reducing craving, you will experience peace. And this peace is oftentimes accompanied by joy and pleasure. Okay, joy meaning that because you are able to recognize more and more the defects, the drawbacks of craving, you're able to recognize more and more the freedom, the serenity that comes from letting go of craving. And so internally, you feel confident. Internally, you feel inspired. Internally, you feel like you are um, stably grounded on a good meaning, a noble cause, right? A sense of purpose, and so forth. That's really what it's meant by happiness, by piti, in the context of Buddhist meditation. Nowadays, most people have this very hyperbolic descriptions of what piti potentially entail. That it has to be dramatic, it has to be sensational, it has to be mind blowing, and so forth. And people set a very unrealistic expectation of what piti is, and then they end up feeling very frustrated if their quote unquote concentration practice is not able to eke out any meaningful amount of happiness. Okay. And in the same way, too, what do we mean by pleasure? When your nervous system is actively unloading itself of craving, right, once again, it becomes tranquilized, at least to some degree. And so your body will feel, in a metaphorical sense, lighter. Okay. You're likely to experience peace. You're likely to experience equanimity. You're likely to experience, kind of like inner completeness, whereby your mind doesn't have to busily looking for junk food outside of the immediate sensations, outside of the immediate present moment. Okay. And so it feels refreshed, it feels complete, it feels at ease. That's what we mean by uh, pleasure. Now, yes, pleasure and happiness can take on different forms in one's meditation. Sometimes they can become ecstatic, right? They can become very intense, right? Sometimes they'll perhaps manifest in a way that's somewhat different than the way I described it, and that's okay. But primarily, we should understand the Buddhist teaching of samadhi as about reducing craving and not about locking your mind down to some stable object. Okay? And this is why when we read the Anapanasati Sutta, the sutta is supposed to be about breathing meditation, yet it hardly talks about breathing, right? It never talks about how you should just focus on breath or focus on the contact point, right? Or do counting the breath or anything to that effect. Quite the opposite. All the 16 steps they are, building up towards what? Towards a goal of releasing the mind, releasing sankharas, pacifying sankharas, right? Letting go, and so on and so forth. They are all about reducing craving, right? Working directly with craving. Okay, so I hope that this part is clear to everyone. If you have thought or question, yes, please, Albert.
This is something I've thought a lot about regarding craving and having sex,
Yes.
right? Like, do those two go hand in hand? Because if that's implicit and or explicit, there's ethical and metaphysical implications, i.e., advocating for antinatalism, right? Because we need to wipe out, if everyone wipes out desires, then there's no one's having kids anymore, right? So I
Well,
think like doesn't A equal B and then there's C, So it's something I think a lot about, and you explicitly said it. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about it.
okay, so there are quite a lot right there. Um, Buddhists in general do not believe that antinatalism may be like a solution. to human problem, right? Because there's this idea of how consciousness will simply latch onto another kind of body, another kind of identity, if there are no bodies available as a result of the whole society committed to antinatalism, right? I mean, I don't know, some society is forcibly implementing, mass sterilization, and thereby depriving consciousness from, having any kind of way to lend there and proliferate, so to speak. Consciousness will simply move on, right, to different world systems, to different, like looking for different identities to situate itself, so to speak. Now, for non-Buddhist reasons, right, people may argue that okay, they may choose anti-natalism or not, right, and that's a whole separate issue. The Buddha really never really said something like, oh, if you bring kids to the world, somehow you're committing an ethical act, right? You're
No,
performing an immoral act. Yeah.
I'm sorry to cut you off, Professor, but does sex and desire equal? Does having sex equal desire, which
Okay. All right. That's
proliferates suffering?
another issue, right? So, in the end, it is said that when your meditative practice is advanced to a certain level, then what happens? This desire to find fulfillment with another human being, or to find sensual stimulation from like passionate union and so forth, they will naturally disappear. Okay, the mind will, in other words, in the spiritual path, especially after you attained so-called third fruition, fourth fruition, and so forth, the peace that one experiences is so complete that it renders any, additional search for very complex, very expensive, essential pursuit, mood, and unnecessary. Okay, but this doesn't mean that everyone wants to go to that stage, or everyone has that as his or her goal, or that a meditator is currently at the stage where he or she is ready to be a celibate, right? And so it may be the case that a layperson who has a normal and quote unquote healthy relationship may still engage in meditation practice and manage to reduce craving to the extent where the meditator is no longer experiencing very coarse mental defilements like worry and hankering, right? Or like agitation, or excessive control, right? Obsession with ownership, so on and so forth. And then the direct result of that is that even though the person may still be in a relationship, but the relationship is less likely to disrupt, undermine inner peace, and perhaps in some ways may conduce to them. So the when the Buddha talks about how craving is the cause of suffering, he's not saying, no, 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 he's not really recommending that every single individual is equally capable of, or recommended to destroy craving in one fell swoop, right? He describes his path as gradual pacification of sankharas. Another way to describe this is using more skillful conceit to overcome less skillful conceit, using more skillful craving to overcome less skillful craving, until you reach a point where both conceit and craving are completely uprooted. Okay, so that's really the kind of internal logic in the Buddhist training. If you're not ready, if a meditator has not cultivated sufficient conditions to render the mind ready for certain kind of letting go, and then you force the mind to let go. So in this case, you force the mind to give up sensual craving. You force the mind to give up sex, right? In some individual, This will not only be uh, not beneficial, but oftentimes it may prove to be inimical, right? It may prove to be harmful. It may backfire, right? So on the most part, the Buddha was teaching monastics, right? These renunciants. But then there are many occasions where the Buddha also taught lay people. And then these lay people are taught, like to manage their craving in a different way. Yeah, and what happened is once you have some level of craving diminished, your mind will be experiencing unprecedented satisfaction, and it will likely to incline towards even greater freedom. Right? For a mind that's never experienced any profound meditative joy, pleasure, satisfaction, and so forth, it's really, really hard for it to see how can life be any fun without, sex or without, interpersonal romantic activities. Yeah. Okay. I appreciate the question. Any other thoughts? Other comments before we move on? Alrighty. So this next thing I want to,
Professor,
yes,
I
please go
have a
ahead.
question. What
Yes.
do you mean by more skillful craving? Can you explain that a
Yeah,
little bit?
yeah. Absolutely. That's a very good question. So let's say I'm a compulsive gambler. Okay. And I'm trying to quit. And among the many different things that my therapist prescribed, he said, you should also start playing sport, do more sport, get yourself becoming more physically fit and then get the dopamine release, as you engage in sport, and that's going to be helpful, right? So, I look around and I go, oh, you know what? I like basketball and I don't know, pickleball, right? And I try to get into the sport. I fall in love with them. I find them fun, right? I find them fulfilling, right? I love socializing with people on the court. I love, like just staying in good shape and so forth. That could be a kind of craving, right? When you go, oh wow, I'm really becoming good at pickleball. What is that? That's a sort of ego identification, right? And when you go, oh, I so look forward to playing pickleball with my friends tomorrow, right? That's a sort of craving. But compared to the craving experience when you go, oh, I'm so bored, I needed to get to casino, and once you're there, you couldn't control yourself, right? You're like compulsively playing, compulsively squandering away money. Which one is more skillful? Right? And we could talk about how one is skillful, more skillful than the other at so many levels, right? And same thing with regards to conceit. What is conceit in Buddhist psychology? Conceit is any kind of self-identification. When your mind is invested in a phenomena, it goes, this is me and this is mine. That's called conceit in Buddhism. And with regards to conceit, there's also the more skillful conceit versus the unskillful conceit, right? So to give you an example, before we're fully liberated, before we're completely awakened, our mind is all perching on some kind of identity. So I don't know if my identity is about domineering over other people. Oh, I have more money than you. Okay, I have more power than you, right? I'm more knowledgeable than you, right? I'm more articulate than you. I'm more artistic than you. I'm smarter than you. I'm taller than you. I'm better looking than you. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, or conversely, I'm uglier than you. I'm poorer than you. I'm weaker than you, and so on and so forth. And these two will lead to what? Superiority complex and inferiority complex, respectively, right? It will lead to pride. It will lead to, like shame or like low self-regard, respectively, right? Versus, let's say, if my identity is about how, I am a meditator who also looks after his health, right? Physical health. In other words, I'm someone who looks after both my mental and physical well-being. And, I get a lot of joy from helping others, by being generous with other people, by being sincere with my friends. And so my relationships are what? Robust, meaningful, right? Deep, right? Durable, and so forth. Right? This is also a kind of conceit. Why? Because the mind is still going, I am a meditator. The mind is still going, I have good relationships with people, with my family, with friends, with so on and so forth. That's still a kind of conceit. But compared to the former type of conceit, where your identity is primarily about domineering over people or, comparing yourself to other people, right? This latter kind of conceit is more skillful. Okay. And this is one way to think about Buddhist meditative states. And in the early Buddhist suttas, there are many different meditative states you can potentially master, right? You can potentially experience. And all these meditative states, in the end, they boil down to different kinds of craving, different kinds of conceit. Let me give you an example. So, like at the beginning of the semester, we were practicing what? We're practicing to relax the body. We're practicing to get a better feel of the nervous system, to calm the body down so that the body feels more at ease, right? And you try to tap into the sense of easefulness. You try to tap into the sense of the body that is deeply relaxed. Okay. What is the mind doing right there? The mind is performing a kind of craving. Okay. And the mind is developing a kind of conceit, you see. But it is a better kind of craving than, say, sensual craving, right? At the beginning of the semester, we talked about how what is sensual craving like? Number one, it's competitive. Number two, sensual craving only leads to very fleeting, very effervescent, very superficial pleasures, right? So sensual craving, you crave for having good looks, or people admiring your good looks, right? How long does that last? You don't even have to wait until you get old for that to disappear. No. I mean, every moment you're feeling insecure about it. I don't care how good looking you are, right? You put yourself in different lighting, you feel insecure. You put yourself, next to someone else, when you're compared to someone else's look, you feel self-conscious about your own look. Right? And that's the nature of sensual craving, and therefore it's unskillful at so many levels. It's more arduous, meaning that it's more expensive to produce, to maintain. It's stressful. It almost always uh, uh, followed by worry, by hankering. Hankering once again means mental thirst, meaning that you want more, more and more and more. Right? Your craving is just insatiable. Whereas the craving experience in meditation is what? It's not insatiable. It's not insatiable. The craving experience in meditation is mild. It's not intense. Is easily observable, right? And the kind of craving, when used properly, is leading to what? Greater letting go, greater freedom, right? So um, I hope that's clear to you. Oh, and I saw another.
Yeah,
Yes,
I was
please.
just gonna say, so basically it's kind of like what generates less suffering.
That's right. That's right. And most people, when they say, "Oh, I'm experiencing less suffering," oftentimes they have no idea what they're talking about. Like for a compulsive gambler, right? He says, "Oh, I feel less suffering when I am gambling," right? But then, if you're a meditator, then you're in a much better position to see what are the subtle activities in the mind. How are they involved in this present activity? What kind of, short-term, mid-term, long-term consequences they're likely to generate. And the reason that, you know, Buddhists generally look for very specific kinds of happiness and not the essential type of happiness is because even though the sensual type of happiness, the unskillful type of happiness, they feel good at the moment, but then it's oftentimes intermixed with stress. Okay, so even as you are enjoying other people, admiring your good looks, you are simultaneously experiencing some measure of insecurity, you see. And then not only that, but this happiness doesn't last. And so you need to renew your effort. You need to strive more. And sensual happiness requires a lot of busy and complex fabrication on our part. In other words, we need to chase after them really hard. We need to control them really hard. We need to, like plan and worry and, strive and so forth. Yeah. As opposed to, say, the sort of happiness that the Buddha generally advised, the happiness that has a very strong dose of contentment, right? A very strong dose of serenity or peace, right? That is not built on competitiveness, right? And like trying to compete with other people. It's not built on harming people, exploiting people, or harming yourself, or exploiting yourself, and so forth. So in that regard, your pleasures, happiness are more skillful. And in meditation, we will enter into ideally successively higher states of uh, meditative states. And why are these meditative states considered higher than the other ones? They're higher not because somehow you're more, attentively focused, right? Somehow you're more locked into a kind of trance, or your concentration become um, more intense, more laser-like. No, that is not how meditative attainments in Buddhism are ranked, you see. But rather, the meditative attainments are higher. They're higher because there's less craving involved. And therefore, there's less stress involved. It's easier to maintain. It's more characterized by effortlessness. It's less harmful to the mind and the body, right? You don't have to be as busy. You experience even more pervasive, more fulfilling type of peace. And so the mind becomes even more what settled down, immersed, feeling complete. It has less, tendency to latch out, to lash out, to latch onto phenomena and so forth. Yeah, good. And I
Thank you.
saw, sure thing. Yeah. And someone asked, can craving diminish without meditation? Okay, well, it depends on how you define meditation, right? If we define meditation very narrowly as meaning, oh, you need to sit cross-legged, you have to be a Buddhist, you know, you need to treat meditation as like a really formal type of practice, involving all sorts of trapping, like using special hand gesture, right? Wearing special kind of clothes, find yourself in, like a holy place, in a special place, in a ritualized place, then no, right? No, not really, right? But if we were to understand meditation broadly as meaning directing attention to the nature of the mind, to the nature of experience, right? In a more or less consistent way, in a manner that is more profound than the way we usually use attention, then I'm inclined to say we need meditation. It's very hard to imagine that, people could just, stumble upon these experiences, at least in any concerted, consistent, reliable way. Yeah, maybe, there are people due to their uh, special karmic constitution, and they can just accidentally stumble into very meaningful, very profound meditative experiences without formally undertaking meditation training, right? But oftentimes these experiences are what? They're fleeting. And then the person who experiences these fleeting experiences, they don't know how to make sense and then to make use of these meditative experiences. Yeah. So meditation is very, very useful. Now, when some people ask this question, right? Can we diminish craving without meditation? Perhaps. Uh, One of the reasons that we ask such a question is because, there's a part of the mind that finds meditation daunting or boring or just, like you're hoping that, we don't have to deal with meditation and then still reap the benefit, right? Well, here's the thing. Um, Something great about meditation is that it's not a mechanical approach to investigating the mind, right? It's very versatile. It's very it's an adaptive process, and you are your own physician, so to speak. You're diagnosing your uh, meditation, the way you meditate. You're not just using the techniques in a deadpan manner. You're looking at how you're using the techniques, what sort of results they're producing, and therefore you can always, depending on your liking, depending on your temperaments, you could change your meditation style, you see. And so this way you will minimize the frustration you experience or, like feeling, daunting and feeling, uh, feeling that meditation is too hard and so forth. You can make it very easy. You can make it very straightforward. You could really greatly pare it down. You could do meditation in a very formal way, right? And injecting meaning into that formality. Or you could do meditation in a very casual way, right? You're your best doctor. You're your best teacher, and then you want to um, guide the mind. You want to train the mind, and it's kind of like helping a little child, right? You want to make sure that the child is given a chance to develop discipline, but then at the same time, you're not intimidating the child, right? You're not depriving the child of fun, right? You're not, like scaring the child into not wanting to try anymore, right? Okay, good. Alrighty. Any other thoughts before we begin? And by the way, this is great. Okay, I am glad that some of you opened up and are ready to interact more. This is really awesome. Alrighty, so what we're going to do next is I want to give a very short talk on summarizing the body-based satipatthana and the feeling-based satipatthana before we go on to the third tetrad. Okay, so this is my way to summarize the former two tetrads, the first two kinds of satipatthana. And this once again is related to the idea of samadhi, right? Quote unquote concentration. What are the key ingredients to attaining samadhi or to attaining concentration, if you really prefer that word? Number one, right view slash renunciation. This arguably is the most important ingredient. Now, I know this is maybe so different from what you learned previously about Buddhist concentration, right? Previously, you learned how Buddhist concentration, like maybe from other places, that it's just about shamatha. It's just about developing calm, right? Developing concentration, attentiveness, right? Stability of the mind, and so forth. So why is it related to right view? Why is it related to like a robust attitude of renunciation? Well, when you look at Buddhist ideas of jhanas, Buddhist ideas of samadhi, they're oftentimes described as seclusion pleasure or seclusion happiness. Translate that into plain spoken English, it means that um, you are experiencing some measure of freedom, kind of like a vacation, unburdening process um, from very coarse baggage in the mind. A person without right view, a person without renunciation, cannot really go into jhanas. I don't care how much a person works on his concentration skill, like how much he or she focuses on an object, right? The end result is just another concentration skill. It's not jhana. Jhana is a direct function of renunciation. Jhana is a direct function of right view. And this is why when you look at the traditional Buddhist scheme of the so-called Eightfold Noble Path, it starts out with right view and it ends in right concentration. And the way that works is that right concentration is the stabilization of right view, is the consummation of right view. These are not really different things, by the way. Eightfold Noble Path is all about detachment, right? It's all about renunciation. It's all about letting go. It's all about dispassion and so forth, right? So right view is about that. Right concentration is about that. It's not the case, oh, right view is about wisdom, and then right concentration is about concentration. It's about just focusing the mind on some neutral random object. It doesn't work that way. Right concentration in this context really means that your mind becomes stabilized, non-distracted, clear, um, committed to, dedicated to, right, wholeheartedly immersed in what the process of dispassion, the process of letting go. That's what right concentration is about. Okay. Um, Now you might ask, what is renunciation? Well, uh, crudely stated, renunciation is about how you're increasingly discerning the problems, the pathology of attachment, and you yearn for freedom, you yearn for higher freedom, right? Yes, maybe you've experienced love in the world, but then you're asking yourself things like, is there something that is even more unconditional than this kind of love that I experience, right? Perhaps you experience different kinds of happiness in the world, but then you're asking yourself, is there a happiness that's even more purified, that is not so mixed up with, these other things like worry, like insecurity, right? Like, possessiveness, right? Is there a kind of happiness that's less dependent on conditions? Is there a kind of happiness that is more satisfying, that's more fulfilling, right? That doesn't just come and go and then leaving you feel empty when it leaves, and your mind yearns for that which is higher. Okay, that's a kind of renunciation, right? You're increasingly recognizing how the old former habitual way of being is deeply unsatisfactory. And this unsatisfactoriness is related to the way the mind still holds on to baggage, still clings to, unresolved issues and so forth. And you recognize the benefit of letting go. That's what renunciation is about. Okay. So that's the number one key ingredient in developing Buddhist meditation. What else can we say about it? Well, in the body-based satipatthana and in the feeling-based satipatthana, i.e., the first tetrad that we look at and the second tetrad that we looked at, they're both about pacifying sankharas. And when you're meditating, and even if the sankharas are not completely released, at least they're somewhat tranquilized. Right? At least the coarser sankharas are let go already. To give you a very concrete example of how this works. Usually, when a person's not meditating, how does the mind look for happiness? The mind exerts itself and runs to quote unquote far away places in a metaphorical sense. When you daydream, what happens? You're generating a scenario in the mind, and then you're yearning for that scenario. You're thinking about the scenario. You're striving to make that scenario come true, right? You are lamenting about how the scenario is not coming true. You're discontent about the present moment. And so what is the mind doing? The mind is writhing and turning and busy. And, there are a lot of coarse sankharas going on. And the mind can only recognize happiness, pleasure that are far away, that are hard to get, that barely gets eked out, you see. And then you go, huh, when you're meditating, you started looking for happiness and pleasure or satisfaction somewhere that's closer. And by closer, I don't mean it in a spatial sense. I don't mean it in a geographical sense, right? By closer, I mean something that you don't, that doesn't require so much exertion on your part. You don't have to try so hard. You don't have to lust after something so much, right? You don't need to control. You don't need to appropriate, own, possess, right? Be obsessed about something and so forth. So, for example, you're able to see that, hey, in a body that is relaxed, I could easily find contentment here, right? What happens right there is at this moment, the mind gets fed by something that is closer. The mind is not fed by something that is far away, requires a lot of pursuit, a lot of straining, right? It's very expensive to keep it up, to keep things up that way. Rather, you go, oh, that's right here. It's simple. You relax, you let go, you find pleasure in ease, you find pleasure in relaxation, you find pleasure in contentment, and so forth. Okay. And you realize that the mind what naturally calms down. The mind calms down not because, oh, you force it to concentrate on a mantra, you force it to concentrate on your nose tip. No. The mind calms down because it finds a pleasure that doesn't require the mind to be so busy. Okay. And in fact, this pleasure is so good, the mind is happy to stay here, to not have to, toss and turn and, you know, fidget about. That's how meditation works. And then the other thing I want to say is that when people meditate, when people learn about, like techniques on letting go, they don't do it at a level that is deep enough. So in other words, they may be thinking about letting go. They may be thinking about renunciation, but then their body is still very tense. At the nervous system, at the level of the nervous system, you're not letting go. See? So developing satipatthana, whereby you become more sensitive to your body, whereby you become more sensitive to mind, to feeling, and so forth, is in part because you need to become more attuned to what the body actually is doing, what the body really wants, what the nervous system is like in the present moment. When you simply tell yourself in your mind, let go, right? It creates this amount of relief. But then if you're able to tune into your nervous system, right, you're able to see that your so-called body is really just like a bundle of neurotic tendencies, right? You feel this very concretely, very palpably, and you calm yourself at this level, okay, then you will be able to achieve a relaxation that's much deeper than people can normally do. Now, don't overthink this, by the way. Don't think of this as, ooh, this is something so abstruse, something so hard to comprehend, something that's so hard to attain. No, don't worry about this. Just like when you calm down, when you find your body in the present moment, instead of losing yourself in very complex thought formations, instead of losing yourself in very strenuous pursuits, right? You calm down, you settle into the present moment, you find your body, and chances are you'll begin to feel your body in a different way. Normally, your body is just an idea, right? When you think about your body, there's a body image that comes up in your mind, mind's eye, or maybe your face comes up in your mind's eye. Right? Maybe, you experience your body in a very coarse way, in a very superficial way. Whereas if you just settle into your body right now, relax, right, become more sensitive, chances are you're able to experience a body that is more complete, more subtle, right? Maybe you experience vibrations, right? Body is no longer just an idea, but you could feel how your body is vibrating in the present moment. Right? Maybe you're able to detect how your body is like raring to go. There's this neurotic tendency. The body is agitated. You feel this impulse in yourself. And as you become more attuned to this, right, you relax yourself at this level, you're much more likely to experience ease. So these are the things I want to say about samadhi, about the Buddhist idea of concentration. If you keep these things in mind, right, and you practice consistently, chances are you will experience unprecedented level of peace, even in everyday life. Right? In your everyday life, if you can like frequently allow your mind to be fed by the proper things, then you experience like calm throughout the day. You experience relaxation, serenity throughout the day. What is satipatthana? Once again, it's establishing mindfulness. Why do you need mindfulness in such a practice? Because initially, the practice involves training of high frequency, short duration. Right? You may practice for 2 minutes in your everyday life, and then you forget. Right? You become distracted. Right? Your attention gets captivated by something it finds more alluring. Right? But if you do this with very high frequency, frequently in your everyday life, frequently you go, how is the mind fed? Is the mind fed, by good things right here? So it doesn't have to run to far away places, right? You can just settle into your home, so to speak. Okay. That's really what Satipatthana is about in terms of, its ability to take the meditator into samadhi. Yeah. Okay, any questions, comments about that? If not, we're going to do a short practice session. Okay, so feel free to do the following in a more formal or in a more casual approach. You could choose to turn off your camera at this juncture. It's up to you. Okay, you could once again you could choose to sit upright, making sure that your spine is properly aligned, and so the natural curvature of the spine is engaged. And this way, your chest is not compressed, your chest is slightly opened up, right? You're not hunched, right? And um, there's a good chance that you will feel more alert, right? The mind feels more refreshed as you adopt this posture. Alternatively, you could try to meditate in a very casual approach, however way you choose to do posture-wise. You can recline into a sofa, you could even lie down on the floor, you could stand up, right? You could do leisurely walk even as you meditate. And earlier we talked about renunciation. Renunciation is a sign of wisdom. It means you're waking up, you're realizing the stupidity, the foolishness of the usual mode of existence. If you look at the way the mind typically conducts itself, it carries all these worries and hankering. It's motivated by worries and hankering. And once again, hankering means mental thirst. It's driven by insatiable desire, insatiable craving. And the wise part of the mind goes, I've had enough of this. I'm fed up with it. And perhaps it's already gotten a glimpse of a higher possibility in the past. And this is why your mind is imbued with renunciation. In other words, you see that there's another way of being. And this other way of being involves letting go. It involves diminishing craving. Now, by diminishing craving, I don't mean that you need to destroy everything, right? It doesn't mean that you need to be in a hurry to uproot. Every little instance of movement in the mind. It doesn't mean that. First, discern what is craving. Craving is, in some sense, a synonym for sankharas. It's when the mind is pushing really hard, when the mind is very impatient, when the mind is very controlling, when the mind is lusting after some scenario. You're enthusiastically looking forward to something as opposed to being contented. A contentment is almost a synonym for reduction in craving. So with regards to what is experienced right here, maybe with regards to your body, with regards to your feeling, what is experienced right here, you're contented. Notice how contentment means reduction in unnecessary activities. Once again, this doesn't mean that you need to suppress the mind's activities. It is a recognition that there's so many activities that are just not necessary. They're not helpful at all. Not only do they not solve problems, they add to problems. They aggravate the situation. This blind busyness, this frantic busyness, is just wearing down the mind, causes fatigue, causes stress. Or feel this in the mind. Feel how this is gradually let go of, how this is softened. This internal straining is softened. Be very clear about the way the mind settles into the present moment. You're not forcing it. You're not locking it down. It's like the mind is becoming willing to take a break. And see how the mind is fed, how the mind becomes contented with simplicity. What kind of things are still here that keeps the mind going? Well, there is this zeal, this great interest in the Dharma, a renunciation. Because of the presence of renunciation, you recognize that there is a higher freedom, and you're keenly interested in that. So there's this zeal, there's this refreshingness. You're aware of how you're working towards mental health, mental freedom, mental liberation. And this meaningful task, this purpose is keeping the mind refreshed. You feel grounded. This is actually better than when you're engaged in foolish entertainments, which are hollow in comparison to this. When you're working on something noble without straining yourself, it's actually quite blissful. What else is here? There's a body that is breathing, that is relaxing, that is being soothed by your non-controlling attitude. You're happy to even relinquish the idea of ownership over body and mind. Let these natural phenomena, i.e., the mind and the body, unfold on their own accord without there being intrusive and busy intentions, wanting this, wanting that, not wanting this, not wanting that. You're allowing these natural phenomena to unfold according to the natural principles. What else is there? What else is here? The mind is clear about how craving is reducing. You're not in a hurry to, completely destroy something, to attain something special, to, go into some special place, to have some really, mystical experiences and so forth. You're not even greedy for those things. You're just contented here. Dare we even say happy? We're happy here. Yes, there are sensations rising, passing away, but in general, this is good enough. The mind is well fed. It's sufficiently fed. Compare this with the former busyness you experience. Learn from this contrast so that in the future you'll become better and better at calming the mind, settling the mind, helping the mind to be fulfilled in the present moment, as opposed to having to run to faraway places, run super fast, impatiently, enthusiastically into the future. Or nostalgically or ruefully into the past. Remind yourself to relax into sensitivity. And so that all this, the sensations are associated with contentment, with relaxation, are more manifest to you. The physical sensations, they used to be boring to you, but now, as a result of your relaxing, as a result of your relinquishing, the sensations actually are quite pleasurable. The body is at ease. You're much more likely to become aware of a different kind of body, i.e., the vibrations, a nervous system as a bundle of neurotic tendencies. Now, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, it's okay. Okay, don't worry about it. Okay. Don't actively try to create a special kind of bodily feeling. There's no need to feel frustrated about, oh, I don't experience any kind of subtle body here. No, that's perfectly all right. And just this, the present simple sensation, is good enough for the mind to feel well fed. And this is good for the mind, for it to learn to savor simplicity. This kind of pleasure is not addiction for me. This kind of pleasure is helpful to clarity, to equanimity. This kind of pleasure is readily available. See it for yourself. Don't just treat this as a doctrine. You are fed by something that is immediately here. You don't need to strive. You don't need to go elsewhere. You don't need to spend money. You don't have to think about specific things, plan for something, chase after something. You don't need to do any of that. See for yourself that what is immediately here, what is so close by, the natural bliss is readily available. Develop this. Familiarize yourself with this. Have confidence that if you feed on this kind of pleasure, it will be good for you in terms of promoting physical health, in terms of promoting mental health, in terms of spiritual liberation, in terms of so many things. Be confident about this. Have faith in this. Again and again, you're happy to settle into simple contentment, to the sensations of a body that is relaxing. The Buddhist word bliss, ananda, it doesn't have to be like some mind-blowing thing, even though sometimes it can be. It's primarily about very simple sensations. Right? You remember how when you were sound asleep in the middle of the night, what does the body feel like to you? It doesn't feel particularly pleasurable, but the body is comfortable that it is desireless. In other words, it doesn't need to go anywhere. It's just rested there. In many ways, that kind of bliss is better than whatever kind of intense, variegated sensations it can produce. Now, I'm not asking you to become sound asleep right now, right? Mentally, we're alert, but physically, think about how when you're sound asleep and the body is in bliss, it's perfectly contented. It's so contented, it doesn't even want to move. What does the body feel like when it has no desire? Learn to recognize this. Learn to savor this. A body that has no desire, at least at the moment. A body that is not driven. A body that is not neurotic. A body that is not busy. A body that is not a slave to craving. A body that is not agitated. A body that is not always on the go, trying to get to the next destination, trying to get to the next task, trying to finish another thing. A body that is just here. See how the mind naturally settles down to whatever degree you're experiencing. And no worry if it's not doing a lot, it's not settling down a lot, don't worry about it. As long as you're able to discern this process, you're learning a skill. You're likely to be able to duplicate, to deepen this process. If you're not used to sitting very long, or laying down or standing up for very long, you need to adjust your posture. It's okay to do it, right? But even as you are adjusting your posture, maybe you're moving a little bit and so forth, stay with the task. In other words, make sure that the mind is well fed by contentment. You're aware of how busy the mind is, how much it's trying to strain. And if you feel like there are not a lot of sankharas, there are not a lot of straining, there's not a lot of straining on your part, know that too. There's not a lot of straining. The mind is gradually settling down. And if the mind is not settling down, know that too. And be patient with it. With regards to this mind that is not apparently settling down, you're patient with it. You're not in a hurry. And we're bringing this practice session to an end. If your eyes were formerly closed, please open your eyes and turn your camera back on whenever you're ready. And let me know if you have thoughts, questions about this little exercise. If you'd like to share what you've done, how it feels like. Was it very difficult? Was it very easy for you? Was it very intuitive? Was it, too abstruse? And someone is sharing, that was very nice. Thank you for reminding me that peace can always be found in the present. Yes, that's such an important understanding, right? You just keep this in mind, right? This is kind of like a one potential thing you can keep in mind in a satipatthana practice. Then what happens? Then samadhi will become easily attainable. Then we'll have better and better understanding of what is craving and how to diminish craving. Alrighty, any other thoughts, questions you'd like to share? No? Alrighty, so we will come back at 10:35. Okay. Okay, welcome back. Alrighty, so I would like to now direct our attention to the third tetrad. Okay, you may recall that the third tetrad is the so-called mind-based satipatthana, right? The third of the four satipatthanas. And this is the sutta passage in question, right? From steps 9 to 12. These are about the mind-based satipatthana. Step number 9 is, quote, he trains himself. I will breathe in sensitive to the mind. He trains himself. I will breathe out sensitive to the mind. Step 10, right? The meditator trains herself. I will breathe in satisfying, gratifying, or gladdening the mind. He trains himself. I'll breathe out satisfying, gratifying, gladdening the mind. Number 11, right? He trains himself. I'll breathe in steadying the mind, sometimes translated as composing, concentrating. He trains himself. I'll breathe out steadying, composing, concentrating the mind. Number 12, he trains himself. I'll breathe in releasing the mind. He trains himself. I'll breathe out releasing the mind. Okay? Alrighty, what is going on here? The scholar monk Bhikkhu Nyanamoli has once said that Buddhist meditation is about knowing the mind, shaping the mind, and releasing the mind. And he described these three aspects of meditation as dialectical in nature, meaning that each one of these aspects help the other. And so as you become better at knowing the mind, you would also likely become better at shaping the mind and releasing the mind. Likewise, as you become better at shaping the mind, you're likely to become better at knowing the mind and releasing the mind, and so on and so forth. Okay. And if you look at the way these 9 steps are constructed, they're really about these 3 aspects. And so, step number 9, right? The meditator is to what? Become sensitive to the mind. This is about knowing the mind. And then steps 10 and 11, these are about shaping the mind. And then step number 12, this is about releasing the mind. Steps 10 and 11, both of these are about shaping the mind. These are just examples of how there are different ways of sculpturing, shaping, conditioning the mind. In Buddha suttas, mnemonic devices are frequently used. These are intended as pithy meditation instructions. And so instead of covering all the possible different ways of shaping the mind, there are these 2 that are given. And these 2 are oftentimes understood as a parallel. They're kind of like antithetical to each other. They're opposite to each other. One way to shape the mind is to what? Lift it up, right? So when you try to lift the mind up, you're doing what? You're gladdening the mind. You're enrapturing the mind. And the opposite way of shaping the mind is to calm it down, right? In this case, it's about steadying, composing, concentrating the mind. Okay, so first things first. Let's focus on step number 9 first, which is the first step in the third tetrad. I will breathe out sensitive to the mind. What is the mind here? The word chitta in Buddhism is a loaded term, right? It could refer to so many different things. Okay, so what exactly is the mind? Well, let's look at how one sutta explains this notion, chitta. So this is from Majjhima Nikaya, Sutta number 10. I'm quoting. And how does a monk remain focused on the mind in and of itself? This, by the way, is a coded term for practicing the mind-based satipatthana. So if you're practicing the body-based satipatthana, You what? You remain focused on the body in and of itself. When you're doing feeling satipatthana, you remain focused on the feeling in and of itself. And here you have the person remains focused on the mind in and of itself. Okay, so this is dealing with the third tetrad. Continuing, there is a case where a monk, when the mind has passion, discerns that the mind has passion. When the mind is without passion, he discerns that the mind is without passion. When the mind has aversion, he discerns that the mind has aversion. When the mind is without aversion, he discerns that the mind is without aversion. When the mind has delusion, it discerns that the mind has delusion. When the mind is without delusion, it discerns that the mind is without delusion. When the mind is constricted, it discerns that the mind is constricted. When the mind is scattered, right? When the mind is enlarged, right? When the mind is not enlarged, when the mind is surpassed, when the mind is unsurpassed. Actually, I don't like these translations. I personally would have translated this as surpassable, right? And here, unsurpassable, right? When the mind is concentrated, when the mind is not concentrated, when the mind is released, when the mind is not released. Most of these are pretty straightforward, easy to understand, except this surpassable, unsurpassable. Anyone want to hazard a guess? What is a mind that is surpassable? What is a mind that is unsurpassable? Any idea? Okay. So when you experience a mind that is surpassable, it means that there's a room for transcendence. There's a room for further escape. What does that mean? When the mind is unsurpassable, it means that you're at the higher state.
You're
There's no
awake.
higher escape. Go
You're a
ahead.
Buddha.
That's right.
I was waiting for someone else to say it, but
That's right. In fact, the Buddha's own awakening is oftentimes um, called the supreme unsurpassable awakening, right? Meaning that there is no perceivable higher state. Here's another way of thinking about this. Previously, we were practicing settling the mind naturally into the present moment. And, more or less, you may have experienced that where you go, oh, nice to be able to discover the peace that is here and now. However, with regards to this peace you're experiencing here and now, it can be experienced in a surpassable way or in an unsurpassable way. Okay, so a peace that you experience that is surpassable means you're still able to notice room for improvement. Right now, with regards to this peace, yes, there's peace, but occasionally the mind is still kind of like, boring. I want something more, right? Maybe the mind is resisting with this peace a little bit. Maybe, a thought wells up in the mind, a memory comes up, and then you begin to strain yourself, right? There's tightness, there's tension arising in yourself. Okay. So in this way, there's room for improvement, you see. Yes, you're beginning to experience peace in the present moment, but then your sankharas are not completely purified. You could, there is a possible higher state. Theoretically, you should be able to go into a deeper peace where there is less distraction, where there is less discontentment, where there is less resistance, where there is less craving, where there is less clinging, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, if you experience unsurpassable peace, it means you're experiencing nibbana. It's natural awareness. It's non-abiding. There's no clinging whatsoever. There's no conceit whatsoever. The mind completely cools down. Even with regard to this cool down state, the mind doesn't go, ooh, I attain this. The mind doesn't try to own it. The mind doesn't try to extract pleasure out of it. Why? Because craving is completely quenched in this instance. And here, you've arrived at what is known as natural awareness. There's nothing else you can do, right? You cannot further perfect natural awareness. Or what? What are you going to add to the natural awareness? So that's what surpassable, non-surpassable means. Now, coming back to the sutta passage we just read, given what the sutta tells us, what is the mind in this context? Can someone explain? We've seen all the instances of the quote unquote mind in the suttas. When the mind is constricted, when the mind is not constricted, when the mind is scattered, when the mind is not scattered, right? There are other sister suttas that tell us that you could also look at when the mind has torpor, when the mind is free from torpor, right? When the mind is accompanied by metta, goodwill, right? When the mind is accompanied by compassion, right? When the mind is not accompanied by goodwill, metta, or compassion, and so on and so forth. There are all these other instances. So can someone explain to us what is the mind here? It's a mental state. That's what it is. Okay. Sometimes in other contexts, the mind can refer to awareness itself, right? In other contexts, the mind can um, actually refer to attainment of meditation. So if you have like chitta bhavana, you've attained some high level meditative state, right? So mind can also mean that. But here in this context, the mind as well is a mental state. And therefore, step number 9, being sensitive to your mind means what? It means being aware, being discerning of the present mental state. Does that make sense? So the way to do step number 9 or step 1 in Tetra 3 is to know the mind, to know the mental state, to be in a position where you could perform a sort of self-diagnosis, right? This is what the mind is like, right? These are the properties. This is the state that the mind is in. And therefore, you can then determine the appropriate step 2 and 3. Whether on this particular occasion, maybe you should lift up the mind. Maybe you should calm it down. Maybe you should infuse it with energy. Maybe you should tranquilize it. Maybe you should brighten it up. Maybe you should relax it, so on and so forth. You see? And so the shaping of the mind part comes after the knowing of the mind. And it makes sense, right? It's only in having properly diagnosed the mental state that you're in, are you able to prescribe the proper mind shaping techniques for yourself? So that's what the first 3 steps are about. Okay, any question about that? Another interesting thing about step number 9 is that oftentimes the positive state and the negative state are mentioned in pair. Okay, so for example, you're not just tasked to see whether or not your mind is scattered. You're also tasked to see what the mind is like when it is not scattered. All right. You're not just tasked to see what an angry mind feels like. You're also tasked to see how the mind feels like when it is free from anger. Right. At this moment, when there is an absence of anger, what it feels like. This is another interesting part. Now, traditionally, with regards to step number 9, people oftentimes will examine their minds in the frame of the so-called 5 hindrances. I don't know if you have heard of the so-called 5 hindrances. Okay, 5 hindrances. Anyone know them by heart? There are sensual craving, ill will, right? Restlessness slash remorse, torpor, and finally doubts or uncertainty. Now, in the common material tradition, in a very questionable understanding of the 5 hindrances, these are called hindrances because they obstruct your concentration. They're a distraction from your concentration exercise. Okay. Here, I offer you a different interpretation of the five hindrances based on the suttas. Once again, according to the suttas, Buddhist meditation is not about working on concentration per se. It is about understanding and relinquishing craving. And of all the cravings we experience, the coarsest kind of craving, according to the Buddha, is sensual craving. And then sensual craving has all these different sides to it, as expressed in the five hindrances. And therefore, when Buddhists talked about overcoming the hindrances, rising above the hindrances, putting aside the hindrances, it doesn't mean that they simply become so good at, concentration effort, right? They're able to put aside all these distractions. No. It actually means that a Buddhist, through the power of renunciation, through the power of seclusion, leave behind sensual craving and all its different manifold manifestations. Right? So once again, it's about reduction of craving. Now you might ask, how so? How are the five hindrances all related to craving? Well, the first one is called sensual craving. Duh, of course, this one is about sensual craving, right? What is sensual craving again, you may ask? It's a very special kind of craving. Now, the mind is capable of experiencing very subtle type of craving. For example, you may have gone into very deep state of meditation. You experience profound peace. The mind is hardly moving. But there's a part of the mind that goes, ooh, I love it here. Okay, that's craving right there. Or there's a part of the mind that goes, this is who I am. This is where I am. Where am I? I am in peace. Right? What am I doing? I'm experiencing peace. I'm enjoying peace, and so forth. Okay, there's slight craving right there. This conceit, this craving. But there's a very coarse type of the very coarse type of craving that's already been put aside. That has already been tranquilized by an advanced meditator. So what is sensual craving? Sensual craving is when your mind is very thirsty for a sensual scenario. Okay. So if at this moment you're like, oh, if only I could be with her. Oh, if only I could be with him. Right? And the mind is, fervently churning up all these romanticized notions about this person. This person is beautified, is, romanticized, is, like placed on a pedestal. And then you're experiencing fever, mental fever, that is, you're experiencing passion, you're experiencing obsession. If you look at the way ordinary people behave, ordinary people go about their everyday business, they roam in sensual craving. Most people, most of the time when they're away, what is their mind doing? Their mind is strongly hoping for something. Their mind is strongly feeling insecure, worrying about something. All right. So most people, they want what? They want a lot of fame. They want a lot of money. They want a lot of personal, like getting oneself to become the center of other people's attention. Right. And then worry about the loss of it. They worry about not getting it. And they, all day long, they're agitated, they're restless because they are, quote unquote, consumed by, hijacked by, swept away by, burned by sensual craving. Now, coming back to the five hindrances, we've covered the first one, or sensual craving. What about the second one? Ill will. What is it? Ill will is an aspect of sensual craving. Ill will is not just your generic anger. It's not. Ill will is very specifically what you're likely to experience when your sensual craving is frustrated. is impeded, is outcompeted. Okay. So for example, if right now I'm experiencing sensual craving and I look at some of you guys here, I go, you guys are better looking than I am. You guys are more likely to attract the attention of fellow classmates than I do. This feeling I have right now, it's called ill will. Does it make sense? When my desire gets blocked, when my desire gets impeded, when my desire gets threatened, when my desire gets challenged, and so forth, you're likely to experience ill will. And therefore, jealousy is a kind of ill will. Envy is a kind of ill will. Possessiveness, like, oh, I own my girlfriend, boyfriend, I own this wealth, I own this status, right? And you feel possessive about it, you feel insecure about it. That's ill will. That's ill will. Does it make sense? So, ill will and sensual craving, they're two sides of the same coin, right? Now, what about the third of the hindrances? Restlessness. What is it? It's not just, simple distraction. It doesn't mean that, oh, when your mind is not concentrated, you have restlessness. It doesn't mean that. Restlessness very specifically refers to the general frantic busyness of the mind that is only fed by sensual pleasure. It's not well fed, and therefore the mind is not settled down. It has to remain busy in order to find sufficient food. You may recall the hummingbird analogy I gave a while back ago, right? Why are the hummingbirds darting about flying around so fast, right, in such great hurry? Because they're always at the verge of death. They're always at the verge of starvation. If they don't get enough nectar into their system, they'll quickly run out of calories to burn, right? In the same way, too, a mind that is fed only by sensual pleasure is very superficially fed. It's hungry. It's starving. It's looking for entertainment. It's looking for safety. It's looking for fulfillment all the time. This is why if you don't have like a higher self-esteem, if you don't have like a higher, more skillful kind of pleasure that you have access to, and your sense of worth is only built on, say, your good looks, how happy is that going to get you? Do you know how many celebrities committed suicide or have like a substance abuse problems or, all sorts of crazy things going on in their lives, even though they lead such enviable lifestyle, right? They're some of the most blessed human beings in terms of material abundance, right? And yet they're so deeply unhappy, right? And that's the nature of sensual craving, according to the Buddha. And so restlessness, once again, should be understood in light of sensual craving. Sometimes remorse is added. So, what is remorse? Remorse is a tricky thing. Number one, it's about all the unskillful things you have to do in order to secure sensual pleasure, in order to maintain, to control sensual pleasure. And so the mind is filled with remorse. And also, the mind is filled with depression. So, after sensual pleasure, so let me put it this way. If you experience meditative pleasure, the aftermath is deeper peace. The aftermath is deeper equanimity. It's a good thing. It's a good thing following another good thing, right? But if what you experience is sensual pleasure, the aftermath is emptiness, is hollowness, is depression, is guilt. Oh, I spent so much money. Oh, I wasted my time. I ended up, like harming other people, myself. Oh, I ended up developing this addiction. My life is in a downward spiral and so forth. I recall.
Professor,
Yes, please, go ahead.
it looks like Andre has a question. I'd also
Oh,
like to
okay.
know the answer to that as well.
Sure, absolutely. I
It's
didn't
in the
see
chat.
this question. I don't think let me see. Okay, let me see where was that. Okay. Is the sensual craving for comfort and moving shift to ease discomfort? part of distraction in the mind. Okay, all right, good. Okay. So Buddhists are like to talk about how there are two parts of lived experience. There's the so-called first arrow versus the second arrow. So the first arrow refers to the brute fact of biological phenomena. There are these sensations we're experiencing, and there's not much we can do oftentimes. You may be experiencing uncomfortable sensations, you may be experiencing comfortable sensations as we speak, right? These are um, conditionally arisen, and most of them are beyond direct control. However, there is a so-called second arrow, i.e., how we react to the sensations, to the brute fact of life. And so with regards to discomfort, the mind oftentimes what is subtly resisting. The mind is subtly complaining. The mind is arriving and turning, tossing and turning, and so forth. The mind actually does this a lot of the time. And so when we feel unhappy, and we think, we assume that the unhappiness stems from just life circumstances, right? Oh, my girlfriend's left me. Oh, I lost this amount of money, right? Like people said bad things about me and so forth, right? But oftentimes it's about the second arrow, or more crucially, more critically, it's about the second arrow. The sankharas are you formulated in response to the present sensations. And these responses happen so quickly, they're oftentimes happening in an autopilot mode. They're almost like second nature, reflexive in nature, right? And they're creating stress in the mind. Yeah. So your question, central craving for comfort and moving shift to ease, discomfort, a part of distraction. Now, you will, as you meditate, you will see that some movements on our part are constructive. They actually help the situation. And so, I don't know, like when it gets too hot and you're meditating in the sun and you move yourself to the shade of a tree, right? This is something you can actively do, proactively do to mitigate discomfort, right? So there are movements, there are activities that are helpful. But then on the most part, if you look at what the mind is doing, it's wasting energy on completely non-constructive reactions. Okay, so small part of the energy is dedicated to moving yourself from one spot to another, right? Or adjusting your physical posture as to reduce discomfort and so forth. But a lot of it is impatience. A lot of it is resistance. A lot of it is internal struggle. A lot of it is subtle complaint. A lot of it is, restlessness and so forth. And it's really this part that meditators, focusing on reducing. So when we talked about gradual pacification of sankharas, we don't mean that you're categorically trying to make yourself less and less active. That you want to become like a more and more inactive person. Right? It doesn't mean that. Sankhara, once again, it doesn't mean movement in general. Sankhara means mental exertion, the sort of exertion that creates struggle, that creates torment, that creates pressure, that creates drivenness, right? That creates stress internally. That's the part we're focusing on reducing. And then there's another follow-up question. And by the way, feel free to type out your questions, or if you like, you just unmute yourself and and speak up. It's completely up to you. Okay, if you're shy like me, I personally prefer typing. That's okay too, right? So how does this relate to people with ADHD who replay conversations over and over in their heads? How can this help this restlessness in relation to something that seems to be out of their control? Okay, good, good, good. That's awesome. Now, I don't want to be talking about ADHD per se, okay, but I do want to talk about rumination. The reason for it is because rumination is a symptom for a lot of mental disorders, as well as something readily detectable in personality styles, okay, rumination. So something that happens over and over again, and you seem to, like be trapped in a certain thought pattern, be obsessed about it. A slightly different variation to this is there are people who find that, they're caught up in the looping of a melody, like maybe a commercial jingle that plays over and over in the mind, and they don't know how to get rid of it, right? And this sort of thing, like the rumination and this uh, looping phenomena, they feel like it's something that happens to us, and we're completely helpless about it, right? Their arising seems to be completely, by chance. It's not due to any doing on our part. However, as a meditator, you're likely to find that any sort of looping phenomena, any sort of phenomena that kind of perpetuates and repeats itself, you are subtly contributing to it. You're subtly responding to it. Let me give you a concrete example. So let's say there's this commercial jingle in the mind that plays over and over again, right? I want to stop it, but I couldn't. It just kind of plays on its own. But then, if you really pay attention to this phenomenon, you realize that every time when the tune is playing, every time the melody is playing in the mind, a part of you is kind of humming along. Does that make sense? That the humming along part, that's a sankhara you're contributing. And more than that, as a meditator, you might be able to detect even more sankhara than that, than you're just humming along. There's also a part of you that is really detesting this phenomena. It's like, go away, stop bothering me. Why is this happening to me? What's wrong with me? Okay, and so on and so forth. There is impatience, there is aversion, there's a pushing away, there's fear, there's this, engaging imagination, and so forth. And so as a meditator, you could either single out with precision the sankharas are responsible for perpetuating the looping phenomena. Or you could subscribe to something very generic, like just relax more, just settle more, just let go more, you see. And then, you know, as you relax more, what happened is there is this general reduction in overall sankharas. Okay. So the first method, once again, you single out the most crucial sankharas involved with precision. This takes a little more skill, right? So you're a meditator, you'll be able to recognize that there's a part of you that's humming along the melody. Or in the case of rumination, it's just, it is not the case that the conversations just automatically play over and over again in your mind. No, you are responding to that phenomena somehow. It's just that you haven't detected it. Okay. So the conversation is going, and then you're reacting to the conversations, maybe with aversion, maybe with resistance, maybe with restlessness, maybe, you're dwelling on some of the themes, the contents of those conversations. So every time the conversation comes up, you go, oh, I should have said that to his face. That jerk, it wasn't enough for me to have yelled at him. I should have said this, to bruise his ego even more, to make my point even more clearly, right? And there's regret involved, right? Or, the conversation's over and over, and then you're analyzing the conversations. You're analyzing it all the while feeling insecure. You're like, oh, I should have said that. I shouldn't have said that. Or what does this mean? When she said this to me, what does it mean? Is there a special meaning? Does it somehow convey, like some hidden agenda or some hidden feeling she had for me, and so forth? There are all these reactions going on that makes the mind remain interested in the content. The mind is tethered to that phenomena. Another way
Can
of
I
saying this
ask a
is that your
question?
interest is fueling your interest is fueling this phenomena. Yes, absolutely.
I
Go
kind of
ahead.
have a
Sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt
No,
you.
no, no. Go
I
ahead.
kind of have a related question.
Mhm.
So something I've noticed like in my practice, and this is why a lot of the time just informing my classmates as a mode of honesty, it's kind of been a struggle because I also struggle with rumination, because I am a clinically depressed person. And I struggle with like getting the sensation of crying. And sometimes I cry during my meditations.
Mhm.
I was asking one of the venerables on campus, like, why does this happen? Is this a good thing? Is this a bad
Yeah.
thing? And I noticed too, like, I ask myself the question while I meditate, like as a object of meditation. I don't know if that's productive,
Yeah.
but maybe it could
Yeah.
also be like a form of release. What do you think?
Yeah. Crying could be helpful or not helpful. So it's not the case that, oh, Buddhists are against crying or Buddhists are for crying. Right? There are different kinds of crying. So there's a kind of crying that's therapeutic. That's a part of healing process. That's part of the process where your karma gets cleansed, so to speak, right? And that's the kind of crying where, even as you're crying, you may be experiencing number one, joy, right? Or number two, relief, right? Or that this crying phenomena is undergirded by peace, by serenity, right? By surrender, right? This crying is galvanizing qualities in the mind, such as compassion, like better understanding human suffering. All right, this crying is helping you to give rise to renunciation, so that you become even more sober and clear about why certain activities are burdensome. They're baggage, and you're ready to let go. Right? This crying can be about a realization of your past foolishness, past fallacy, and you recognize how futile that was. You're crying not because you regret, right? Not because you're filled with remorse. You're crying because now I know better. Right? Now that's in the past, right? So crying could be good, right? If you just categorically suppress crying, now you probably deprive yourself of a very useful tool in um, expressing yourself authentically and then cleansing the karma, as I say. Now, crying
I,
can
I
be
s-
bad
I'm
too.
sorry.
Yes.
I find your response very helpful because I've heard like through maybe unreliable resources that crying is not necessarily a good thing during meditation. And I've heard like there's two sides to that coin, and I think you're about to address the other side of the
Right,
coin.
right. So crying can also be bad, right? It doesn't have to always be bad, right? Crying. And by the way, even when crying is good, as a meditator, eventually you'll move beyond that. You'll not, like become stuck in that mode indefinitely, like always using crying as the only way of, um, expressing and then experiencing catharsis and healing and so on and so forth. Eventually, you'll find subtler, more efficacious, more direct way of arriving at inner bliss. And crying can be bad, like how? Some people, when they cry, they pity themselves, right? They wallow in a kind of like pathological self-image, right? They um, reinforce the idea that they're a victim. They cry, and then underneath it, it's just grief. It's just hopelessness. It's just helplessness. There's no serenity undergirding it, right? By the way, it's entirely possible to cry even as you experience peace simultaneously. I assure you, right? Just like it's possible to be crying and be simultaneously experiencing joy. That's entirely possible, right? So, why is it so helpful for us to know our mind, to know sankharas very specifically? And so, when you're crying, you're very sensitive to the sankharas involved. And you know whether it's helpful or not. And even when it's helpful, or even when it's not helpful, kind of crying that's happening, you would know how to tweak it. You would know how to engage the crying so that it becomes helpful, so that it'll take you to a better place. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. Good. Alrighty. And I see another question coming up. This is great, by the way. So would you say that those who have ruminations is part of mental disorder with a feeling of helplessness, recognizing the sankhara a form of doubt? No, no. Okay. So um, I was in the middle of explaining the five hindrances. I didn't get a chance to get to the other two, right? The remaining two, right? So I haven't had a chance to address doubt yet. Okay. But and I'm not sure I completely understand your question here. Rumination is part of mental disorder with a feeling of helplessness.
Okay, so a lot of people who have ruminations in form of a mental disorder.
Right.
So as I had asked before about ADHD,
Mhm.
um, they feel a form of helplessness when
Right.
it comes to stopping the
Right.
constant thoughts that
Gotcha.
are, so it's like they're hearing the music,
Right.
they're thinking about something, they get
Right.
distracted, and it's like trying to bring everything together. And
Right.
so in the form of meditation
Yeah.
and they're recognizing, okay,
Yeah.
this is the
Okay.
sankhara.
Yeah. 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 So what happened with ordinary people is that they're usually just so tightly wound up, tightly wounded, and um, there are all these crazy sankharas going on without their detecting. There are all these crazy sankharas going on, and they're actively participating in them. Okay, so if in general you're someone who's very wound, who's very tense, all right, who's not used to experiencing ease on a regular basis, right, with high frequency and so forth, you're in a very bad position to know what sankharas are. So that's the first thing I want to say. And then the other thing is, yes, helplessness is a kind of sankhara, is a kind of conditioning, right? It's a conditioned response. So helplessness is not equanimity. It's not effortlessness. When you are helpless, let's say, in psychology, people talk about learned helplessness, right? When you're helpless, let's say, I'm this dog that's acquired learned helplessness, right? When my master is beating me, right? And when I experience learned helplessness, it's not the case I completely surrender to the experience. No, but rather I cower myself into a ball of tightness, right? There are these, once again, bundles of neurotic tendencies are happening. So helplessness is a kind of activity, despite the, seeming passive facade of it, right? Let me give you another. This is not directly related to your question, but I think it would help illuminate what we're getting at. Going back to the looping melody that plays in the head, or you couldn't stop the tune and you're bothered by it a great deal. Right? In the past, I really had students who had this problem. They came to me and I go, why don't you really just focus on how you're humming along, the way you participate, the way you engage, the way you interface. In other words, the contact point between your mind and the sound. Okay, see if you're able to detect, say, for example, annoyance. See if you could detect, for example, humming along and just focus on these, relax these sankharas. They do it for 2 hours and the phenomena goes away. Yeah, they do it for half a day and even these ruminating patterns would go away. Yeah, there's a reason that the so-called mindfulness-based uh, psychotherapies are so useful, right? I'm not saying that the way these things are designed are optimal yet, but even in their less than optimal way, right? These mindfulness-based modalities, they could be very effective because they help the patient become more aware of how they are contributing, how they're adding to what they're experiencing. Yeah.
Would you say that that's a form, that's a good way to guide them through the meditation as to pinpointing that discomfort or the agitation
When
and
it comes to teaching, there's no fixed dogma, right? There's so many variables. So as a compassionate and discerning teacher, we um, improvise, we adapt, we oftentimes we do this through trial and error. We see what works with this patient, with this person, what doesn't work, right? And if something works, something doesn't work, maybe um, you help the person tweak the use of the technique in a slight way, in a subtle way, and then it becomes useful, right? That's possible too, right? You tweak it a little bit, and then the person is able to deepen whatever benefits, he, she was initially experiencing. Yeah. So I'm hoping that, like um, having taken this class, you don't end up just, memorizing a whole bunch of techniques, right? The sequence of meditative steps and so forth. You have a better grasp of the heart principles behind Buddhist meditation, and so that you be able to, tailor to the needs of the moment and be creative, and then all the while being consistent, being truthful to the lineage of spiritual liberation. Yeah. Okay. So coming back to our discussion of the so-called five hindrances. Okay, um, I was just talking about restlessness and remorse, right? And then there's torpor. Torpor being the fourth of the five hindrances. And as I was saying, the five hindrances should not be understood as simply distractions from concentration exercise, but rather they're about sensual craving, right? And Buddhist meditation should be understood as seclusion from and then becoming dispassionate towards, right? Sensual craving. And the fourth one, torpor, what is it about? Boredom, lethargy, mental sluggishness, and so forth. It is when you don't feel like there is sufficient stimulation from the available sensual pleasure. That the mind what habitually shuts down, habitually goes into a to like a boredom mode, to a hazy mode, to anesthetize itself, to intoxicate itself, right? To become half dazed in daydreaming, to become half dazed in sleepiness, and so forth. Okay, so that's also a possible response on the mind's part towards sensual craving. And then finally, there's doubt, there's uncertainty. You can understand this as just, experiencing a general sense of directionlessness, right? By doubt, we don't mean that, oh, you doubt the Buddha, you doubt the Dhamma. It doesn't mean that, right? So Buddhism is not like like a um, religion based on just faith articles alone, right? It's not a religion that argues that, oh, you're going to hell if you believe in the wrong thing. You're going to um, secure eternal reward if you believe in the right thing, right? It's not a religion like that, right? So doubt here very specifically means directionlessness. You're not knowing what to do, where to go, how to conduct yourself, right? You have no idea where to perch the mind, for example. You have no idea um, where to draw meaningful, robust, secure happiness and pleasure, right? And so the mind is at a loss. The mind is, um, hazy, without purpose. And even when it asks questions, it's not asking good questions. It's asking questions that's just wasting its energy, right? It's just like a unconstructive expression of one's frustration, unconstructive expression of one's restlessness, right? Rather than, being able to work on the key activities that are involved. Yeah. So those are the so-called five hindrances. So starting next week, we will be doing some exercises around them in the context of the so-called mind-based satipatthana. For this week, once again, please be reminded to submit your weekly journal, and you could write about anything that we talked about today. It doesn't have to be a comprehensive summary of everything we talked about. Okay, you could focus on any one thing, two thing. It's up to you. Okay, or you could just focus on your own personal approach to the techniques that we talked about today. Yeah, is that clear to everyone? The journal part. Are there questions, comments before we end the class?
Professor, I have the recording. I tried sending it in an email. It wouldn't attach. I think it's too big. Do you have
I
a
see.
Dropbox I can send it to?
Okay. Um, so I'm not really like uh,
Me,
technologically
me
savvy
neither.
at
Me
all.
neither. Me
Okay.
neither.
So I am very fortunate to have few people willing to help out. Would you mind reaching out to Xiaojing, our fellow classmate? If you don't have each other's email, Xiaojing, may I ask you to PM Albert your email
Albert.
so that maybe you are able to help him?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Professor Albert, how can I get to your email? Can you
Uh,
Yeah,
send
or
me?
what you could potentially do is
I'll send it
so
to you right
so I know this is asking a lot of you, Xiaoting. Would you mind getting Chris involved? Chris, he's a tech person. You remember Chris Johnson? He's the guy that you've been sending the recording to,
Yeah,
Chris Johnson.
yes, yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
So would you mind doing this, like coordinating with Chris and Albert
Okay,
and Shaq and
I know
just
I know Chris also, so voila.
okay, great. That's awesome. That'd be great. And just making sure that this recording is uploaded to Moodle as well as the YouTube
okay,
site. Yeah.
okay. I will
Thank you so
talk
much.
with
Really appreciate
Albert
this.
later.
Yeah. I
Okay,
am, you will not believe how ignorant I am when it comes to technological issues. And this is, I heard, not uncommon among Buddhist studies professors. So that's my lame excuse, right? But thank you for your patience and thank you for all your help, in helping, the fellow classmates to be able to access these recordings. Yeah. Okay, anything else on your mind before we go? Are we good? All righty. So please take care. I'll see you next time. Bye bye,
Thank
guys.
you.
bye bye.
Thank